The shuttle shook hard as it cut through the thick orange clouds of Valith 9, and Dr. Maren Hale gripped the armrest with white knuckles and a grin she could not hide. She had wanted this posting for 2 years, ever since the first blurry thermal scans of the Kitharn had crossed her desk back on Earth, and now the planet filled the viewport like a bruised fruit, swollen with storms and volcanic light and the promise of something no one else in the galaxy had been brave enough or stupid enough to try. The shuttle landed on a platform carved into black volcanic rock, and the heat hit her face the moment the doors opened, wet and heavy and smelling of sulfur and something sweet she could not name. A tall figure stood waiting at the edge of the landing zone. Station Commander Rethvan was Qualari, which meant he stood nearly 7 feet tall, with dark green scales and a long jaw full of teeth he never seemed to bother hiding, and his yellow eyes tracked Maren as she approached. Stepped off the ramp with her single bag slung over one shoulder. "Dr. Hale," he said, and his voice was flat and cold like stone dragged over stone. "Commander," she said, and she stuck out her hand. He looked at her hand the way someone might look at a strange insect on their plate, and he did not shake it. "Your quarters are in Block C," he said, already turning away. "Your predecessor lasted 4 months before requesting psychiatric evacuation, and I trust you have read his file." "I have," Maren said, following him across the platform toward the squat gray buildings of the research station. "He was Tolavari, right? Insectoid species, compound eyes, very sensitive nervous system. He was an excellent scientist." "I am sure he was," Maren said. "But he was also a prey species trying to study an apex predator, and that is like asking a rabbit to write a book about wolves." Rethvan stopped walking and turned to look at her, and for a long moment neither of them said anything. "You are very confident for someone whose species has been part of the Galactic Ecological Preservation Corps for less than a decade," he said. Maren smiled at him, and it was the kind of smile that had gotten her into trouble on 3 different continents and 2 different planets. "I grew up on a ranch in Montana," she said. "I have been confident since before I could walk." He did not smile back, but something shifted behind those yellow eyes, and he turned and kept walking. The station was small and functional, and full of people who did not want her there. The next 2 days as she settled in, and she could feel their doubt like a cold wind at her back, wherever she went. There was Thyla, the Pellini liaison officer, a small furry creature barely 4 feet tall, with enormous dark eyes and ears that folded flat against her skull whenever she was nervous, which seemed to be always. There was Jorek, the Kolari security chief, who was even bigger than Rethvan, and who looked at Maren the way a butcher looks at a chicken. There were the Tolavari lab technicians, who clicked and buzzed to each other in their own language whenever she walked past, and she did not need a translator to know what they were saying. "The human will not last. The human does not belong here. The human is going to get herself killed." Maren ignored all of it, because she had work to do. She spent the first 3 nights alone in the data lab, reviewing every scrap of footage and every sensor log the station had collected on the Kytharn over the past 2 years. The Kytharn were magnificent. They were 6-legged beasts, low and wide and armored with interlocking plates of bone that shifted like tectonic plates when they moved, and their spines ran in ridges along their backs and could deliver a venom that would stop an alien heart in seconds. They were territorial, aggressive, and had destroyed every drone, every robot, and every remote sensor the station had sent into their nesting valley. The official reports described them as hostile and unpredictable, and recommended extreme caution and distance. But Maren was not reading the official reports. She was watching the footage, really watching it, the way she had learned to watch animals back on Earth, not looking at what they did, but looking at why they did it. And on the 3rd night, Alone in the blue glow of the data screens, she found what she was looking for. The cubs. There were 7 of them in the current. Litter, fat little things with soft plates and stubby spines, and they played. They wrestled and tumbled and chased each other through the geothermal steam vents, and when one got too rough, the others would pile on top of it until it squealed. And then they would all scatter and start again. Marin leaned back in her chair and felt something warm spread through her chest, because she knew this game. She had seen wolf pups play it in Yellowstone, and lion cubs play it on the Serengeti, and her old golden retriever play it in the backyard when she was 9 years old. Play was not random, and play was not waste, and play was not something that hostile and unpredictable animals did. Play was how social animals learned trust. She pulled up the matriarch's behavioral data and cross-referenced it with Earth predator models, and by dawn she had a theory that made her heart pound and her hands shake. The Kytharn were not hostile, protective. Every single act of aggression the station had recorded was a defensive response to perceived threats. Drones buzzing near the cubs, robots stumbling into nesting territory, sensors emitting frequencies that mimicked rival predator calls. The Kytharn were not monsters. They were mothers. Marin wrote her proposal in one sitting, and she walked it to Rethvan's office before breakfast. He read it in silence, his yellow eyes moving back and forth across the screen. And when he finished, he looked up at her with an expression she could not read. "You want to enter the nesting valley?" he said. "Yes." "On foot?" "Yes." "Alone and unarmed?" "Yes." "Dr. Hale, the last drone we sent into that valley was crushed into a ball the size of my fist." "I am not a drone," Marin said. "No," Rethvan said. "You are considerably more fragile." He denied the proposal, and Marin thanked him politely and left his office and walked back to her quarters. She sat on her bunk and looked out the window at the distant smudge of the nesting valley, where volcanic steam rose in lazy spirals against the orange sky. Then she pulled her field bag from under the bed and began to pack. A canteen, a notebook, a strip of dried protein rations, and nothing else. She did not pack a weapon because she was not going to war. She was going to say hello. Marin left the station before the sun came up, when the sky was still the color of a bruise and the air was thick and wet and warm against her skin. She disabled her locator beacon at the perimeter gate because she knew that if Rethvan could track her, he would send a team to drag her back, and a team meant boots and weapons and noise meant failure. The path to the nesting valley was not really a path at all, just a narrow gap between walls of black volcanic rock, where bioluminescent fungi grew in clusters of pale blue and gold, and Marin walked through it like she was walking through a cathedral, quiet and slow, and full of something that was not quite fear, and not quite joy, but lived somewhere in between. It took her 2 hours to reach the outer edge of the valley. The valley was a bowl carved into the earth by ancient eruptions, wide and flat at the bottom, with steam vents hissing through cracks in the ground, and the air shimmered with heat. The sweet sulfur smell she had noticed on her first day. She could see them. The Kytharn were spread across the valley floor, enormous armored shapes resting in the warm mud near the vents, and the cubs tumbled and played between them like puppies in a yard. Marin's heart was beating so hard she could hear it in her ears, and her hands were shaking, and she wanted very badly to turn around and go back to the station and live a long and boring life. Instead, she stepped out from behind the rocks and into the open. The reaction was immediate. The matriarch rose first, and she was enormous, bigger than Marin had imagined from the footage, a mountain of bone plates and bristling spines, with eyes like hot coals set deep in a skull the size of a dining table. The matriarch's venom glands swelled along her jaw, pulsing with a faint green glow, and she opened her mouth and made a sound that Marin felt in her teeth and her ribs, and the base of her spine. It was not a roar, it was a warning, low and deep and full of a promise that needed no translation. Leave or die. Every cell in Marin's body screamed at her to run, and the screaming was loud and old, and came from a place deep inside her, where 1,000,000 years of ancestors had survived by listening to exactly this kind of sound. But Marin was human, and humans had spent those same 1,000,000 years learning to do the one thing no other species in the galaxy seemed capable of. She sat down. She lowered herself to the ground slowly, turned her body sideways so she was not facing the matriarch directly, dropped her gaze to the dirt, and breathed. In and out, slow and steady, the way she had learned to breathe around wolves and bears and big cats back on Earth. She made herself small, and she made herself still, and she waited. Back at the station, Rethvon found out she was gone when her morning check-in did not come. Perimeter gate logs, and saw the disabled beacon, and for one brief moment his composure cracked, and he said a word in Qolari that had no direct translation but roughly meant, "that suicidal mammal." He scrambled the security team, but Jorek stopped him at the door with a hard look and harder words. "If we go in armed, we trigger a stampede," Jorek said. "Every Kytharn in that valley will charge, and she will be the first thing they hit." Rethvon stood very still for a long time, his claws clicking against his thigh in a rhythm that meant he was thinking. And then he ordered the long-range thermal imaging array brought online. They watched from the command room, a dozen alien faces lit by the blue glow of the thermal display, and they saw the small bright shape of a human sitting on the ground 30 meters from the largest apex predator on the planet. "She is dead," one of the Tolavari technicians whispered. "She is not dead yet," Thyla said from the shadows. Corner of the room, where she sat with her ears pressed flat, and her small hands clasped together, so tightly her fur had gone white at the knuckles. An hour passed. The matriarch circled Marin 3 times, each pass closer than the last, and each time Marin stayed exactly where she was, breathing slowly, not looking up, not running, not fighting, just being there like a rock or a tree, or anything else that was not a threat. 2 hours passed. The matriarch lay down. The command room was silent, and Rethvon realized he had been holding his breath, which was something Qolari almost never did because their respiratory system was not built for it, and it hurt. 3 hours passed, and then the cubs came. They came the way all young things come to something new, in bursts of courage, followed by frantic retreats, rushing forward 3 steps, and then scrambling back 5, and Marin could hear their high-pitched chirps and the clicking of their soft little feet. Plates as they moved. One of them, bolder than the rest, got close enough to sniff her boot, and Marin felt its hot breath through the leather, and she had to bite the inside of her cheek to keep from laughing. Another one circled behind her and nipped at her hair, and a third climbed onto the bag she had set beside her and began chewing on the strap. Marin did not move, did not reach out, did not try to touch them, because this was not her moment to choose. This was theirs. The sun moved across the sky, and the steam rose and fell, and the cubs grew braver, and by late afternoon they were tumbling over her legs and using her back as a ramp, and one of them had fallen asleep against her hip. On the thermal display back at the station, Phila watched the small bright shapes of the cubs cluster around the small bright shape of the human, and she whispered something so quietly that no one else heard it. "She is one of them." Because Qolari had excellent hearing, but he said nothing. He just watched. Marin came back at nightfall, walking through the perimeter gate with dirt on her face and Kytharn saliva in her hair, and scratches on her arms from tiny claws that had not yet learned to be gentle. Rethvon was waiting for her. "You disobeyed a direct order," he said. Yes, she said. You disabled your beacon and entered a restricted zone without authorization or equipment. Yes. You sat on the ground in front of the most dangerous predator on this planet for 7 hours. Yes. He looked at her for a long time, and she looked back at him, and she was too tired to be afraid of whatever punishment was coming. What did it feel like? He said, and his voice was different now, quieter, with something underneath it that she had not heard before. Marin thought about the question, really thought about it, and she remembered the matriarch circling her, and the sound of her own heartbeat, and the hot breath of the cubs on her skin, and the weight of the small one sleeping against her hip. It felt like coming home, she said. Rethvon did not understand what that meant, but he remembered the way she said it for a very long time. He turned and walked back into the station without another word, and Marin stood alone in the warm dark, and looked up at the unfamiliar stars, and laughed softly to herself, because she was alive, and the valley was waiting, and tomorrow she was going back. The days became weeks, and the weeks became a rhythm that Marin fell into the way water falls into a groove in stone, naturally, inevitably, as if it had always been this way. Every morning she walked to the valley before sunrise, and every evening she walked back, covered in dirt and scratches and the sharp sweet smell of Kytharn musk, and somewhere in between she sat in the steam and the heat and watched the cubs grow. She gave them names. Ridge was the biggest, a thick-skulled brawler with a chipped plate on his forehead, who liked to headbutt things, including Marin, including rocks, including his own siblings when they were not paying attention. Soot was the darkest, almost black, quiet and watchful, with eyes that tracked everything and gave away nothing. Quill was nervous and fast, and covered in more spines than any of the others, and she startled at loud noises and hid behind the matriarch whenever the wind changed. And then there was Ember was the runt. She was smaller than the others by a full head, with thin plates that had not hardened properly, and copper-red markings that made her stand out against the dark volcanic ground, like a flame against ash. The other cubs pushed her aside at feeding time, and when they played their wrestling games, she was always the first one pinned, and the last one to get up, and she would shake herself off and trot back for more, with a stubbornness that made Marin's chest ache with recognition. Ember was also the first cub who had touched Marin on that first day, the bold one who had sniffed her boot, and she was the one who came back every single morning and sat beside Marin while the others played. Phila noticed. The Pellini liaison officer had started coming to the observation ridge above the valley, not into the valley itself, because the mere thought of being that close to a Kytharn made her ears fold so flat they nearly disappeared into her skull, but close enough to watch through her scope. The small one is with her again, Phila would report over the comlink each morning, and each morning her voice was a little warmer and a little less professional. Ember, Marin would say. You should not name them, Phila would say. Too late, Marin would say. And then one morning Phila said, Ember is limping, and her voice was worried. And Marin knew that it was too late for Phila as well. Marin had seen it the day before, a slight hitch in Ember's front left gait, a flinch when she put weight on the paw, and by the second day the limp was worse, and Ember could not keep up with the others during play. Marin got close enough to see the problem on the third day, when Ember lay down beside her and rolled onto her side the way she sometimes did when she wanted her belly scratched, which was a behavior that would have made every xenobiologist in the galaxy lose their collective minds if they had seen it. There was a thorn embedded deep in the pad of Ember's front paw, a thick black spike from one of the volcanic bramble plants that grew along the valley walls, and the flesh around it was swollen and hot. That is going to get infected, Marin said quietly, and Ember chirped at her and licked her own paw, and looked at Marin with eyes that were too bright with pain. Marin knew the rules. She knew the protocols and the regulations, and the 17 different forms she was supposed to fill out before making physical contact with a research subject. And she knew that what she was about to do could get her expelled from the GEPC and banned from every research station in the galaxy. She also knew that if Ember could not walk, the matriarch would leave her behind when the pack moved to the next nesting site, because that was how Kytharn survived, by being strong enough to keep up. And Ember would die alone in the valley. Ember's paw in both hands. Ember flinched and snarled, a high, thin sound that was more fear than anger. And Marin held on gently and firmly, and said, I know, it hurts. I am sorry, just hold still for me. She could feel the matriarch's eyes on her back like 2 points of heat, and she did not turn around, because turning around would mean looking the matriarch in the eyes. And looking the matriarch in the eyes right now would mean one of two things. Either the matriarch trusted her, or the matriarch did not. And if she did not, then Marin would be dead before she finished turning. Marin gripped the thorn between her fingernails and pulled. Ember screamed, a sound that echoed off the valley walls, and every adult Kytharn in the clearing raised their heads, and the matriarch took one step forward. The thorn came free, black and bloody and as long as Marin's finger. Ember yanked her paw back and bit Marin's wrist, not hard enough to break skin, but hard enough to leave marks. And then she scrambled to her feet and limped away 3 steps, and turned and looked at Marin with her head tilted to one side. Marin held up the thorn so Ember could see it, and then she tossed it away. Ember looked at the thorn, looked at Marin, and then walked back and pressed her head against Marin's knee and stayed there. The matriarch settled back down, and Marin breathed again. The next morning was the morning that changed everything. Marin was crouched at the edge of the clearing, setting up a new recording sensor, when she heard the sound of small armored feet moving fast across hard ground. She turned and saw Ember running toward her from across the valley, not walking, not limping, but running at full sprint, with her copper-red plates flashing in the morning light. And Ember was not slowing down. Ember launched herself off her hind legs and flew through the air directly at Marin's legs. In every alien species in the galaxy would have said duck, or dodge, or run, because a Kythar was coming at you with its mouth open and its claws out. Marin caught her. She caught Ember mid-air with both arms, scooped her up against her chest, and spun around in a full circle, with the cub wriggling and snarling and licking her face, and Marin laughed. She laughed the way humans laugh when something fills them up so completely that the only way to keep from bursting is to let the sound out, big and loud and messy. And she spun again, and Ember chirped and kicked her legs and tried to bite Marin's ear. And Marin just held on tighter and kept laughing. On the ridge above the valley, Phyla dropped her datapad. It hit the rocks with a crack, and the screen shattered. But Phyla did not notice, because she could not look away from the human spinning in circles in the middle of a predator nesting ground, holding a beast that could kill most sapient species with a single swipe, laughing like she had just been handed the best gift in the universe. Phyla's eyes were wet, which confused her, because Pellini only produced tears in response to extreme emotional stimulus, and she did not understand why watching this made her feel like something inside her chest was breaking open in a way that did not hurt. That evening, Rethvan reviewed the footage from the valley sensors. He sat alone in the data lab and watched the moment Ember jumped, and the moment Marin caught her, and the moment they spun together laughing, and he played it again and again and again, 7 times in total. He did not understand the laughter. He did not understand why the human had spun around instead of bracing herself or dropping the animal or pushing it away. He did not understand why his claws had gone still against his thigh, and why the rhythm of his breathing had changed, and why he kept replaying the footage even though he had already seen it. Clearly enough, on the 7th viewing, He paused the recording on the frame where Marin's face was visible. Mid-spin, with Ember in her arms, and her eyes squeezed shut, and her mouth wide open with laughter. And he stared at it for a long time. "What are you?" he said to the frozen image of the human, and the human did not answer. But the question sat in his chest like a stone he could not swallow. 3 days later, the footage was uploaded to the station's regular data submission to the Galactic Ecological Preservation Corps headquarters. And from there it was shared with the Research Review Board, and from there it leaked to the Galactic Media Network. Within a week, every sapient species in the known galaxy had seen a small human woman catch a venomous predator cub mid-air and spin around laughing. And nothing was ever the same after that. The footage spread across the galaxy the way fire spreads through dry grass, fast and hot and impossible to stop. Within 3 days, it had been viewed on every major sapient network, from the Tolivari data hives to the Dranathi deep ocean broadcast relays. And the comment feeds were a chaos of confusion and wonder, and something that most species did not have a word for, but humans called delight. The Polini watched it and wept, because they were empaths, and the joy radiating from the human in the footage hit them like a wave, and for days afterward, Polini across the galaxy reported feeling a strange warm ache in their chests that they could not explain. The Qualeri watched it and said nothing, because Qualeri never said anything about things that unsettled them. But the footage was downloaded and shared privately among their military strategists more times than any other species. The Tolivari watched it and were horrified, because to an insectoid prey species, the image of a small, soft creature voluntarily grabbing a venomous predator and spinning with it was not heartwarming, but deeply and fundamentally insane. And somewhere, in the cold, deep waters of a distant ocean world, an ancient Dranathi, one of the slow, vast whale-like beings who had been part of the Galactic Council since before most species had discovered fire, watched the footage in silence, and then watched it again, and then closed their enormous eyes, and hummed a low note that their attendants had never heard before. The political response was immediate. The Tolivari Science Council filed a formal complaint with the GEPC within a week, demanding that Marin's project be shut down and her access to Valith 9 be permanently revoked. Their statement called her work reckless emotional contamination of a pristine ecosystem and a dangerous precedent that prioritizes individual sentiment over scientific objectivity. The Qualeri High Command filed their own request quietly and through back channels, asking for expanded data access to Marin's research. And their request used words like tactical implications and interspecies influence capability and potential applications, which meant they were not interested in ecology at all, but in what it meant that a human could walk into a predator's territory and come out carrying its young. And the GEPC Review Board, caught between a complaint and a commendation, and a galaxy full of people who could not stop watching a human laugh, did what bureaucracies always do when they do not know what to think. They ordered the project suspended, pending review. Marin received the order on a Tuesday morning, and she read it twice, and then she set down her datapad and walked to the window of her quarters and looked out at the valley. Suspended, she said to no one. Suspended, said Phila, who was standing in the doorway, with her ears flat and her small hands balled into fists. Those cowards, those absolute cowards. Marin looked at her and was surprised, because Thyla was not the kind of person who called anyone a coward, and the fury on her small furry face was so fierce it almost made Marin smile. "It is a review," Marin said, "not a cancellation." "It is fear," Thyla said. "They are afraid of what you have done, because they do not understand it. And when people are afraid, they build walls and call them procedures." Marin did not argue, because Thyla was right. She complied with the order, because fighting it would only give the Tolivari ammunition, and she stayed inside the station perimeter, and she waited. But Ember did not wait. On the third night of the suspension, a sound woke the entire station. A high, keening cry from somewhere beyond the perimeter fence, rising and falling, in a pattern that Marin recognized immediately, because she had heard Ember make it once before, when the other cubs had pushed her away. From a feeding, it was a distress call. Marin ran to the perimeter and saw Ember standing just beyond the fence, her copper-red plates dull in the moonlight, her head low and her mouth open, calling for Marin. "Go back," Marin whispered through the fence, and her voice broke on the second word. "Go back to the valley. Go back to your mother." Ember pressed her face against the fence and made a sound that was not a roar and not a chirp, but something in between, something small and lost, and she did not leave. She came back every night for a week. The crew could not sleep, and the mood in the station turned dark and strange, because it was one thing to debate the ethics of human xenofauna contact in a conference room 10,000 light-years away, and it was another thing entirely to listen to a young animal crying in the dark for someone it loved. Phyllis stopped sleeping almost entirely. She spent her nights at the perimeter window, watching Ember pace and call, and something hardened inside her that had always been soft. And when the review board scheduled the formal hearing via HoloLink, Phila requested permission to speak. The hearing was held in the station's main conference room, with the review board appearing as shimmering holograms around the table. 3 Tolivari, 2 Kolari, a Polini, and the ancient Dranathi counselor whose name was so long and so low frequency that most species simply called her the Elder. The Tolivari representative spoke first and used words like contamination and attachment disorder and anthropomorphic projection, and recommended immediate termination of the project and relocation of Dr. Hale to a non-field position. Marin sat and listened and kept her face still, because she had learned long ago that anger was a door that opened in only one direction. Then Phila stood up. She was so small that she had to stand on her chair to be seen by the holograms, and her ears were flat, and her voice shook, but she did not stop. "I have watched Dr. Hale work for 2 months, Thyla said, and I have watched every other researcher on this station work for over a year, and I am telling you that what she has accomplished is not contamination." She pulled up the data, approach distances, behavioral changes, stress hormone levels in the pack, and she laid it out in clean, precise numbers that told a story that Tolivari could not argue with. The Kytharn Pack's aggression index has dropped 43% since Dr. Hale began her work, Thyla said. Cub survival rates are up, territorial displays are down, and the matriarch has expanded the pack's tolerated perimeter to include the entire observation zone, which means for the first time in this project's history, we can actually do the research we came here to do. She paused and looked directly at the Tolivari representative. Dr. Hale did not contaminate this ecosystem, Thyla said. She opened a door that the rest of us were too afraid to knock on. The room was quiet. Then Rethfan spoke. He had been standing against the wall with his arms crossed and his yellow eyes half closed, and when he stepped forward, every hologram in the room turned to face him, because when a Kolari station commander spoke at a review hearing, it meant something. "I denied Dr. Hale's initial proposal," he said. "I thought she was reckless. I thought she was foolish, and I thought she would be dead within a week." He paused. "I was wrong about all 3, he said. "In 30 years of service, I have never seen a researcher who belongs in the field more than Dr. Hale, and I recommend the project continue with expanded funding and full institutional support." The Tolivari protested, the Kolari abstained, the Polini voted in favor, and the deciding vote fell to the Elder. The ancient Dranathi was silent for so long that some members began to wonder if they should move to adjourn. Of the holograms flickered, and then she spoke in a voice like deep water, moving over sand. "The beast cub chose her," the Elder said. "That is data. and you do not override data with fear. She voted to continue. Marin received the reinstatement notice that evening, and she did not celebrate, and she did not gloat, and she did not say a single word to anyone. She just packed her field bag and walked to the perimeter gate and stepped through into the dark. Ember was there. The cub saw her and made a sound that was not a cry anymore, but something bright and sharp and urgent. And she ran at Marin so hard and so fast that when she hit, Marin went down flat on her back in the volcanic dirt, with a 30-kilogram predator standing on her chest, licking her face. Marin lay there in the dark, with the stars above her, and a beast on her chest, and she laughed until she cried. And she held on to Ember with both arms, and said, "I am here. I am not leaving. I am." And in the command room, Rethvon watched the perimeter camera feed, and saw the human lying on the ground, laughing with the Kytharn cub on top of her. And he turned off the monitor, and sat in the dark for a while, and did not think about anything at all. Because some things were not meant to be analyzed. Some things were just meant to be witnessed. 2 years changed everything and nothing at all. The station on Valith 9 had grown from a handful of gray buildings on volcanic rock into a proper research campus, with new labs and new quarters and a landing pad that could handle 3 shuttles at once instead of 1. And the perimeter fence had been taken down entirely because it was no longer needed. The Kytharn did not need a fence to know where the station was, and the station did not need a fence to keep the Kytharn out, because somewhere in the 2 years since a human woman had sat down in front of the matriarch and refused to be afraid, the boundaries between the two had become something softer than metal and wire. They had become trust. Marin was 36 now, and her hair was longer, and the sun of Valith 9 had turned her skin a deep brown. And she had a scar on her right forearm, from the time Ridge had gotten too enthusiastic during a greeting and caught her with a spine, and she wore it the way some people wear a trophy. People wore medals, not with pride exactly, but with a kind of quiet satisfaction that said she had earned it. Ember was fully grown. She was no longer the runt, not by any measurement that mattered, because what she lacked in size compared to Ridge or Soot, she made up for in something that the research papers called affiliative confidence, but that Marin just called being brave enough to love things. Ember's plates had hardened into beautiful interlocking shields of deep copper and black, and her spines were long and sharp, and carried enough venom to stop a Quillari's heart. And every single morning, without exception, she found Marin and slammed into her at full speed. Marin had learned to brace. She would hear the thunder of armored feet, and plant her legs wide, and bend her knees, and Ember would hit her like a freight train, and Marin would stagger back 2 steps, but she would not fall, and she would wrap her arms around Ember's huge neck, and press her face against the warm plates, and say good morning the way she had said it every day for 2 years. The other researchers watched this ritual with expressions that ranged from amazement to terror, depending on how new they were. And there were many new researchers now. Marin's work had become the foundation of something the GEPC had never imagined possible, a new discipline called Integrative Xenofauna Relations, which was a fancy way of saying that someone had finally figured out that the best way to study animals was not to spy on them from a distance, but to earn their trust and live beside them. Researchers came from across the galaxy to learn how, and most of them were terrible at it at first, because most sapient species in the galaxy had evolved either as prey or as ambush predators, and neither of those backgrounds prepared you for the human approach, which was to walk up to something dangerous and try to make friends. But they learned. Marin's co-lead now, officially titled the Director of Empathic Bonding Research, and she had published 4 papers and given a keynote address at the Galactic Science Collective, and she still could not enter the valley without her ears going flat against her skull. But she entered it anyway. Every single day she walked down the path from the ridge into the valley, with her small hands shaking and her enormous eyes wide. And she sat in the clearing with the Kytharn moving around her like armored rivers. And she collected her data, and she talked to the cubs, and she did not run. Marin had asked her once why she kept doing it when it still scared her so much. And Phila had looked at her with those huge dark eyes and said, "Because you showed me that being afraid and showing up are not opposites." And Marin had not known what to say to that, so she had just hugged her, which had confused Phila greatly, because Pellini did not hug, but which she had come to understand was a human way of saying something that words were not big enough to hold. Rethvon was still the station commander, though he had been offered promotions twice and turned them both down. And no one at the GEPC headquarters quite understood why a decorated Quillari officer would choose to remain on a Death World research station when he could have had a comfortable post on any core world. Rethvon understood why, even if he did not say it out loud. He had written a paper, his first and only academic publication, titled On the Unique Ecological Role of Humans, Predator Empathy as an Evolutionary Adaptation, and it had become the most downloaded xenobiology paper in the Galactic Science Collective's database within 6 months. The paper argued, in the careful, measured language of Quillari scholarship, that humans had evolved on a death world alongside predators and had survived not by becoming the strongest or the fastest, but by becoming the most emotionally adaptable species in the known galaxy. They could fear a predator and love it at the same time. And this impossible contradiction was not a weakness, but the most powerful survival trait any species had ever developed, because it meant that humans could form bonds with anything, anywhere, under any conditions. The galaxy read the paper and argued about it in conference rooms and comment feeds and late-night discussions on 100 different worlds. And Rethvon did not participate in any of the arguments because he did not need to. He had seen the proof with his own eyes every morning for 2 years. It was on a warm afternoon near the end of the second year that the delegation arrived. They came on a diplomatic cruiser, representatives from 6 species, including a Quillari general with scars on his scales and cold eyes that had seen wars Marin did not want to imagine, and a Tolavari ambassador who still looked like she smelled something unpleasant. Elder herself, the ancient Drannathi, who had cast the deciding vote 2 years ago. They were led to the observation ridge, because that was as close as the security protocols allowed for non-trained personnel. And they stood in a line and looked down at the valley where the Kytharn moved through the steam and the bioluminescent light. Marin was down there, sitting in her usual spot near the central vent, and Ember was beside her, massive and copper-bright, and resting with her head on Marin's lap, in a position that would have made the old Talavari researcher faint. And then something small moved at the edge of the clearing. A cub. Ember's first cub, born 3 weeks ago, tiny and clumsy and soft-plated, with markings that were a mix of copper and charcoal. And it had its mother's curiosity and its mother's stubbornness. And it had been watching Marin with enormous bright eyes since the day it was born. The cub crept forward on unsteady legs, weaving between the other Kytharn. The steam vents, and Marin saw it coming, and went very still the way she always did, and the cub got closer and closer, and then it crouched and wiggled its hindquarters the way young predators do when they are about to pounce. The cub launched itself at Marin's ankle, and Marin scooped it up with one hand, lifted it to her chest, and spun. She spun in the steam and the golden light with Ember's cub in her arms, and the cub squeaked and wriggled and grabbed at her hair with tiny claws, and Marin laughed. The sound carried up from the valley to the ridge, clear and bright and full, and the delegation stood in silence and watched. The Tolavari ambassador's antenna had gone completely still, which was the Tolavari equivalent of shock. The Pellini representative was crying openly. The Quillari general stared down at the valley for a long time, watching the human spin with the beast cub, watching the adult Kitharn around her rest undisturbed, watching something that should not have been possible by any known rule of predator-prey dynamics or interspecies behavior. He turned to Rethvan, who stood beside him with his hands behind his back. "Is this why humans are so difficult to defeat in war?" the general asked. Rethvan considered the question the way he considered all questions, slowly and thoroughly, and with more thought than most people realized was happening behind those yellow eyes. "No," he said, "this is why they are so difficult to hate." The general said nothing, but he looked back at the valley, and something in his expression changed, in a way that Rethvan recognized, because he had felt it himself 2 years ago, in a dark command room, watching a human laugh on a perimeter camera. It was the feeling of understanding something you did not have a word for. The delegation left that evening, and the station returned to its rhythm, and the sun set over the valley in bands of orange and gold and deep volcanic red. Marin sat in the clearing as the light faded. An ember lay curled around her like a wall of warm armor, and the new cub was asleep in Marin's lap with one paw hooked around her finger. The bioluminescent fungi began to glow as the darkness came, blue and gold, soft as candles, and the valley filled with light that did not come from the sky. Marin hummed. It was an old song, something her mother used to sing on the porch of the ranch house in Montana, on summer evenings, when the sky turned pink and the horses came in from the fields, and Marin had not thought about that song in years, but here in the dark, on a planet 50 light-years from home, it rose out of her like water from a spring. The Kytharn around her were still. Their breathing slowed, and their spines lay flat, and one by one they settled into the mud and the warmth, and let the sound wash over them, and whether they understood it as music, or simply as the voice of the strange small creature who had walked into their lives and refused to leave, did not matter. They listened. On the ridge above the valley, Rethvan stood alone and watched the fading glow and heard the faint thread of the human song, carried up on the warm air. And he thought about his paper, and about the words he had written in the conclusion, words that had been downloaded and read and debated across the galaxy, but that had come not from research, but from something deeper. Other species approached the galaxy with caution, with calculation, with fear. He had written, humans approached it the way they approach everything, with outstretched hands and the unshakable belief that anything alive might be a friend. He had paused a long time before writing the last line. It is perhaps the most terrifying and beautiful thing about them. He stood on the ridge and listened to the humans sing, and the stars came out above him one by one, blue and gold below, and somewhere in the warm dark a beast cub slept in the arms of a woman who had crossed the galaxy to find something that had been inside her all along. The ability to look at something wild and dangerous and strange and say, without hesitation, without conditions, without fear, "You are worth knowing."